I missed Tuesday because of that.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to welcome you to come in and take a seat. My name is Jordan Baller. I have the honor of serving as coordinator for the Kuyper Conference and Prize at Calvin University and Calvin Theological Seminary. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this final plenary session for the conference. I've got a few announcements and some housekeeping items before I get to introduce our plenary speaker. First, I want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, to our generous and hospitable hosts at Redeemer University, especially Jess Joustra and the Walter Center. It's been a fantastic conference, and it's been great working with them. It's a pleasure. I want to mention, yes. I want to mention again the generosity of the Reed Trust. There's a handout that's in all of the folders, and just thank the Reed Trust for their underwriting of the Reformation Legacy Award session yesterday, but also the conference in general. The Kuyper Conference and Prize is located in its institutional home at Calvin University and Seminaries at the DeVries Institute for Global Faculty Development, and Matt Lundberg, the director of the DVI, the DeVries Institute, is here. So we're very thankful to be housed there and to be able to continue to run this program. A few announcements. The dates are set for next year's Kuyper Conference, which will be back in Grand Rapids. Those dates, and it runs Tuesday through Thursday again, April 2nd through 4th, 2024. So those dates are set. We'll run that in conjunction again with the Henry Institute Symposium, so that will run April 4, 5, and 6. So the Henry Symposium on Religion and Public Life. We've had a nice cohort of people who are interested in the programming in both of those conferences. So we're going to schedule those in proximity again so that people might be able to go to those. There's also an announcement, a paper announcement in all of the folders about a new journal initiative called Neo-Kuyperian. So I want to highlight that and encourage those of you who've got papers or have been thinking about publishing things to submit to that journal. One of the things you get to do when you're organizing things is make mistakes. So I want to apologize. There is an associate editor that was inadvertently left off of the printed version. Dirk Van Keulen of the Neo-Calvinism Research Institute is also going to be an associate editor of that journal. If you go to neokuyperian.org, the website is updated with that information. There's more information there. We've learned many things over our time together over the last day and a half, 2 days. One of the things we've learned is that love is patient. And that's one of the things I want to say in praise of our plenary speaker, Vince Bacote. He was first asked to be a plenary speaker at the Kuyper Conference back in 2020, when it was not just going to be a Kuyper Conference, it was going to be a Kuyper Centennial Congress on the 100th anniversary of Kuyper's passing in 1920. Sadly, the North American part of that did not come off at all, which was planned to be in New York City, and the Amsterdam part of it did come off, albeit in modified form because of the pandemic. So not only has Vincent been patient, but the rest of us have been patient to hear Vincent speak in a plenary role. Vincent Bacote is a professor of theology at Wheaton College and director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics. He's author of books including The Political Disciple and The Spirit in Abraham Kuyper's Public Theology. He's a generous and prophetic voice. One of the things I really appreciate about Vince is his courage to say things that we need to be here, but his ability to say things that we need to hear in a way that we can actually hear them. And so please join me in welcoming Vincent Bacote.
Thanks for that introduction. And it really is a privilege to be asked to do this and to be here. And it's been a great time. So I called this Sealing the Cracks in light of the theme of Kuyper and Kintsugi, a Neo-Kuyperian healing process. So just so you know where it's going, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it all began, how there was some complication, we'll call it. And then I'm going to propose some ways to attend to the complications. Right, so in other words, this is not a hit piece. Or if anyone's a journalist here, no one should write, as some people wrote in 1998, Abraham Kuyper humiliated at Princeton. Right? Some people wrote because they didn't like certain things that happened at the conference in 98. Now, it was rough. There's some things that happened in 98 at that conference, and we can talk about that. But this is not about an exercise in humiliation. It's really about an exercise, big picture in stewardship. So I'll start out by telling you about when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I remember learning the nursery rhyme about Humpty Dumpty. You know, for those not from the States, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That made me sad. I thought, you can't? What happened? Why can't we do that? Well, you know, this is what you know children think, right? But what if, when you're a little bit older, Humpty Dumpty becomes someone from the Netherlands named Abraham Kuyper, and you want to try to put some things back together and attend with the legacy in putting things back together. So here's what you must understand about me and Abraham Kuyper. I was someone who was a culture-affirming Christian, but who only had a theological intuition about why it was okay to be a culture-affirming Christian. Because in the context of my Christian formation, there was only dissonance with cultural engagement rather than affirmation. And it seemed right to me that Christians ought to be engaged in politics, culture, economics, the arts, etc. But most of what I encountered said, arm's length at best, avoid the worldliness, really. And that just didn't seem to sit right with me. But I had no argument. I had no theological language for that. And so eventually, while I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to do an independent study about theology and culture featuring Abraham Kuyper. And so I'd been looking forward to this for over a year in terms of putting my program together. And so I read the Stone Lectures. And when I read in the first Stone Lecture, when Kuyper described common grace, there it was. For me, it was really like theological medicine is what it was. It was like, oh, this is it. You know, elsewhere I've written about it, it was like a theological oxygen mask for me, because here was language about how what is proper to us as Christians, because of common grace, is the ongoing participation in God's work. Right? You know, that language to flee not from the world, but from that which is sinful in it. Right? In other words, that we should still go on participating in every area of life as Christians. And there it was. But I kept reading. And if you keep reading in the first Stone Lecture, Kuyper talks about the historical unfolding of common grace. Complications emerged. The complication that emerged was when he described where civilization was coming from, it was strangely European. And he, particularly the challenge at greatest was, when he made reference perhaps to a certain curse, perhaps in Genesis, that's actually to Canaan, not to Ham, but he said it was. And he said the development went along the lines of those three children, right? And I'll never forget the line, no impulse for higher life has come from the third group. This was a complication. you might say, in light of this conference, seemed to be a crack for me. And the thing is, though, is that I thought, well, it's the 19th century. A lot of people thought that. I'll give you a pass, is what I thought. So I was disturbed but undaunted. Because really, you must understand, it was like I had fallen in love. And because now it's like, oh, this is it. This is it. I've found my place. I've found my theological home in a way. But I kept reading. Lecture 2, okay. Lecture 3, okay. Lecture 4, okay. Lecture 5, okay. Lecture 6 begins pretty nice. But, you know, getting near the end of the book, he's making a contrast between election and evolution and asking about how do we talk about what the differences are. And if you like, after it's over, I can show you in Google Maps exactly where I was when all this happened. I think it was a Saturday night. I can tell you what direction I was facing when I was sitting at the desk. When I read that he said, talking about the differences, to put it concretely, if you were a plant, you would rather be a rose than a mushroom. If an insect, a butterfly rather than a spider. If a bird, an eagle rather than an owl. Among the higher vertebrates, a lion rather than a hyena. Being man, rich rather than poor. Talented rather than dull-minded. Of the Aryan race than Hottentot or Kaffir. Now this was not something that I could just let go. And you must understand, because I'd gotten to chapter 6, I was already thinking about, because I was planning to go to doctor work, this is my figure. This is what I'm going to talk about. This is what I'm going to engage. And now I was in a crisis. Because I still wanted to talk about what I'd fallen in love with. And about the person who'd gotten me there. But all of these things started going through my head. I was confused. I was vexed. And I was certainly devastated. I had to put the book down. You might say, you know, it's like I wished I could put the book down, close my eyes, and that when I opened my eyes, it was something else. But it wasn't. But it wasn't. And I had to deal with it. And so I also had to deal with the fear of what I thought people might say. How can you study someone like this? How can someone like this be your person? How can you be, if you will, faithful to what you are if you study this person? There was all manner of vexation. The crisis was real. And I think it's important to say that the crisis was real because sometimes when I've talked about this, and people understand that I use the term Kuyperian to describe myself, it's like they think I just didn't notice this. So what no one must forget is that the crisis was as real as it gets. It was as real as it gets. And of course, that's not the only place where he talked about that. Now, open parenthesis, by the way. Someone once said, and talked, there was the Kuyper Embrace Conference at Princeton, they were talking about this, and they said, look, he's just making an illustration, etc. To which I say the following. And please understand, if that's the way you're thinking about it, please understand this. He had choices. He had choices about what he could use to compare. And there are clear value judgments made in what he said. And by the way, if you think that that's not a sufficient argument, just keep reading Kuyper about race, because that's just one example, because there are others. Of course, the thing is, that's not the only crack in Kuyper when Kuyper falls off the wall. I went forward and, my dissertation's on Kuyper, the book's out there. And I'll tell you about how I got there momentarily, but there were other things. I learned that for some people, they called father the father of apartheid. Well, that was also a problem. Now, I'm with Craig Bartholomew in saying that I'm fine with saying he's partially responsible, but not completely responsible. Never mind the fact that apartheid emerged like after he's dead. But the point is that the word on the street was, and arguably still is in many places, that, oh, Kuyper, apartheid, right. So that was a problem. But then that wasn't the only problem. I remember the first time I came here to Redeemer University College. I think it was 2006, or it was 2005 or 2006. And a bunch of us went to breakfast with Al Walters. And I remember Al saying the following about when Kuyper was in the United States. He said, Kuyper was terrible to people on that trip. And I thought, oh no. Really? So there was that. But that wasn't all. It's hard to read Kuyper and read about him and not discover that, one, he was definitely a genius. But it's like he knew he was a genius. He was a person who, I think we can safely say, was intoxicated with his own greatness. It's a hard thing to be a greatly gifted person, but it doesn't require you to be inescapably intoxicated by your greatness. But he was. And then as a consequence of that, I eventually learned, he, because of perhaps being so excited about all that he could do, because he could do a lot, he was never able to really cultivate a true successor. Right? There wasn't room for anybody else to be someone to whom he could hand the baton. That was also a complication. And then, just last week, as a matter of fact, I was at an event, I was telling somebody I was here, I was going to talk about some of the complications with Kuyper. They said, you mean like the fact that he didn't go to church very much? And I thought, okay, yes, that too. Now, is that he did not go to church. He went to church, perhaps a lot apparently, until the mid-1880s. But eventually it tailed off, apparently. He liked what he was writing for Sundays, apparently, but not going to be with others on Sundays. So that was a problem. And my point is that, of course, those are only some of the cracks with Kuyper. Some of you could probably say, oh, you left out something. So there's lots of cracks with, if you will, my Dutch Humpty Dumpty. What do you do? What do you do? So before I tell you what I've done and what I propose that we do, I want you to be aware of something. If you come into my office at Wheaton College, you will see there's a framed picture of Abraham Kuyper in my office. That framed picture is not there because it's what I need when I need to vent. It's there because, this cracked person is like still my guy. In spite of all of this, and of course, more than all of this. So what do we do? Well, we have to face the brokenness, and we have to make some kind of plan to deal with him rather than to take the pieces and crush them, put them in a dustbin and say goodbye. There's a temptation, of course, to do that, but I think that is the temptation when you want the world to be simple. When you want everything to just be nice and easy. But this is not the world between Genesis 3 and Revelation 21. And the thing is, of course, is that it's not that the only things that are in Kuyper are the things that are the cracks. There's a reason that I had this theological version of falling in love. There's a reason why every time I read him and then I go, well, you see, this is why. This is why his picture is in my office. It's not an easy path. It's not an easy path. But it is how, and this is how I began to address it, it's how I became a critical thinker. Because I had to figure out how to deal with what was there, but also to think about what I really appreciated and how to work with what I appreciate. When I'm thinking about the theme of this conference, there is an idea prompted or catalyzed by what is done in kintsugi. That's what the sealing the cracks idea comes from. But it's not exactly like it. So we can say inspired by kintsugi, right? Because it's not exactly the same. And here's what I mean. So if you think about a bowl and you're going to put it together, you're going to seal it with something else, and you see what's in the cracks. As I understand kintsugi, you're doing that once. That is not what I think we need to do. We need something that seals the cracks and that is strong, but we need something that we're going to keep reapplying. And the reason we're going to keep reapplying it is because we continue to work with the tradition and we continue to revise and refine it. Not unlike what Kuyper was doing with Calvinism himself. Because you're continuing this sealing process, right? In other words, you're going to keep coming back. It holds, but because it's not completely perfect, it probably degenerates a little bit because it's not completely perfect. So you keep trying to apply something. So what do we apply to get there? Well, first we do have to understand that, by the way, Kuyper himself is on the other side. And so now he sees. Now his perception is clear. And so it is not about healing Kuyper. God is taking care of that. But what do we do with what is given to us? Because the tradition remains, even though now he sees and now he is healed apart from his body, he'll be completely healed as the rest of us all will be healed in the final resurrection. What do we do? Number one, something that at least I had to do, and maybe you've had to do, not with Kuyper, with something else. Number one, set aside what I call the messianic gaze. The messianic gaze is when something can come out maybe two ways. Number one, someone you trust or someone you admire says, oh, you've got to read this person. In fact, you should read everything that this person has written. And if you're getting on board with that, you might get very excited about this. And you're thinking, oh, this is it. This is my figure. This is my person. This is my tradition. And a strange thing can happen. You might not ever say, don't tell anybody I told you this, but I think that they are also a Messiah. You might not say that. You go, no, Jesus is the Messiah. But what is going on is you're thinking, but this person's kind of close, is what you're thinking. And so it can happen because you went with what was recommended to you and then you fell in love. Or it could be like me, you discover Kuyper and then it happens and you're like, oh yes. And in my case, even though I knew he was a racist, he was my guy. And of course, other people had their figures, especially like in doctor work, right? And it's like, my guy, as opposed to your figures. I'm going with my guy. How about that? And the point is, of course, that what can happen there when you're doing that is, they're strangely rising up into being something that's borderline messianic. And the problem with that is that if they're borderline messianic, you're really setting yourself up. I think that when we teach people about figures, we need to teach them that remember that these figures also needed to be saved themselves. That they, in a tradition, is not the saving thing. God saves, not those who share with us perhaps incredible things out of what has happened through God's salvific work. So we have to set aside a messianic gaze, because a messianic gaze doesn't allow us to really look at them truthfully. And if we have a messianic gaze, what are you going to do when your Humpty Dumpty moment happens? When down they go, when your devastation comes, because you discover they what? They did what? They said what? Or you care about X, they said nothing about X. Or if they did say something about X, boy, was that a disappointment. What are you going to do? But if you don't make them a Messiah, you don't need them to save you. You can say, I really like what they have to offer. And they're good things that they offer. But I have no expectation that they're going to take me to the promised land, because they can't. Because they're not the Messiah. Jesus will take you to the promised land. Kuyper will not take me to the promised land. So again, maybe I'm the only one that's had the messianic gaze issue. But you may have others around you, or maybe you yourself have had those moments where the messianic gaze has emerged, because it's not like anybody's necessarily planning to have it, but it can be a consequence when you really get into something. But when you get into it, you're also on the way to the disappointment, because you will see that they cannot save you. You will see that they are not the Messiah. You have to have a realistic gaze. And that realistic gaze does need to be a long one, not unlike what cinematographers do with what's called a long take. In a long take, you stay on the action for a long time. Sometimes a long take is just, okay, these two people were sitting at this table for 15 minutes having a conversation. Or there can be long takes like those in the film 12 Years a Slave, where you can't escape the horrific action. Steve McQueen, the filmmaker of 12 Years a Slave, was asked why he had those long takes. And he said because he didn't want to let the audience off the hook. And here's the thing. Christians of all people, when it comes to figures, should be those who are unwilling to try to find ways to get off the hook. Because we shouldn't be expecting any figure to at some point not to reveal to us that they too needed God and that they too were missing things. It shouldn't be a surprise to us, unless, of course, and at a conference that is of Reformed orientation, I'm doubting this, but unless, of course, some of you actually believe in entire sanctification and you believe that that figure is the exemplar of entire sanctification in everything that they said and they did. In which case, by the way, you believe even what Wesley didn't believe. Because he believed that people might be made perfect in love for God, but they still needed to learn and they still needed to grow. They still had vistas of growth ahead. We discover with figures, especially when we do the long takes, oh, they show me what they're great at and they show me where they need to grow. And the point is, it's okay if a figure is not perfect. It's fine. To admit that a figure is not fine is not to do a hit job. It's to admit, oh wait, they too are a human being with gifts, with liabilities as well, who may have grown in certain ways, but who may have been really good at showing other ways in which they needed to grow. That's really not a problem. But sometimes with figures, with the way that people handle them, they must actually be pretty close to messianic. And this, I can hold on to them. Or if they're not, I must dismiss them. I must dismiss them. This is not what we should do. We should see what is there and follow the truth about what is good and admit what is not so good. If we set aside a messianic gaze, we can do that. And please understand, It's like when I tell my students about a figure or a movement that they might think is terrible. I'll say, listen, something might be 99% wacky, crazy even, terrible even. But if there's 1% that they got right, don't lie about the 1%. Tell the truth about the 1%. You can say the 99%, please. Why are you reading this? So you can see madness, that's why. But don't let the fact that you're talking about the madness lead you to lie about the fact that they got 1% correct. Tell the complete truth. This is what I believe we should do. Setting aside the messianic gaze for a more realistic gaze, where, as we were reading about Kintsugi, just as they stare at the bull, we stare at the figure, and we see the cracks, and we see what is great, and we see what is not so great, but we also, in our attention, we see big picture. How is this helpful? How is this helping us along the way? So that's the first thing. The second thing is something that's inspired by Carl F. H. Henry's book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, which he wrote because these Bible-centered people, these fundamentalists, were people who cared a lot about believing the faith, but seemed to be quite good at ignoring actually doing something about it in terms of social issues and social concerns. And so that inspired me to think about something I call the perpetual uneasy conscience. What is that? What do I mean by that? I don't mean something that is negative, but what I mean is a disposition where we have a posture towards God as humble learners rather than proud experts. Where based on something I heard Sarah Coakley say, we're people who are willing to be disturbed by God so that God can show us better ways of thinking and living. I think sometimes, depending upon whose jersey we're wearing theologically, we so want to protect our tradition that we're unwilling to be disturbed by God. But the question is, what is it that we're after here? Are we after worshiping a tradition, or are we after worshiping God? Because if it's worshiping God and this tradition is helping me, hey, nobody says you need to get rid of your jersey. But your jersey, again, is not the thing that you need to confuse with God. And if we don't make that confusion, then we're able to be those who enjoy, in my case, being this Neo-Kuyperian person, but I'm open to being disturbed and moved to say, oh, maybe I need to think about this. Maybe I need to propose this. Maybe I need to consider that question. Rather than thinking, as I did certainly early in my career, think mainly about protecting the tradition, rather than thinking about engaging it and developing it. So I think having a perpetual uneasy conscience is an important thing, because it enables us to be those very truthful people. I think that's important. Number 3, the importance of the life of the church as actually being part of one. Because we need each other. Kuyper needed people. Now, some of you may say, he probably knew he needed people, but he was not very good at always responding to what he needed. It's possible. But I guess, at least to everyone in this room, self-included, I want to say that, we need to be people that are in church and not just writing about it, but also that we are genuinely participants in the community. Yes, making our contributions, but yes, receptive to those who might say to us, hey, do you know that you are drinking your own Kool-Aid right now? Do you know that because of your giftedness, your head's getting bigger than this room? We need people in our lives so that we can be people that, if there are great gifts that are being put into practice, we're able to actually do this well, but to do it with the help of others, helping us not believe our own hype. Because the point is not to not do our thing, but to not think that, as they say sometimes these days, you know what time it is? My time. Right? That people say, you're thinking it's a little bit too much about being your time. So we need people in our lives that way within the church. Now, also about the church, there's something that Kuyper said that I think is really helpful in thinking about how to go forward with what the church is learning and teaching. Because there's participating in the church, but there's also thinking about where the church is going forward here and throughout history and around the world. So this is from Kuyper's closing address at Utrecht. He says, Christ posits an all-embracing and absolute principle. That is, from him a whole new life derives its beginning. Up till now, we have seen only a very small part of the eternal life treasure that lies in that principle. A part of what that principle bears has emerged, but by far the larger part is still concealed. One can aim at preserving either that which has emerged so far from that principle or the principle itself. Genuine orthodoxy must do the latter. It must be concerned to keep not just a few blossoms that have budded on the plant, but the plant itself. Along with the formative power present in its roots, that plant, along with the promise of the innumerable blossoms its life brings us. That life which you have in Christ, that life in its uniqueness, in its sharply delineated principle, and in its eternal fullness, to have and to hold that life is our sacred calling, for only that Christianity has in it the germ of life, which can regenerate the world, and you are the ones called to bring that life to the world. Then you have in your hands the fiery medicine which, when every other remedy has proved useless, bears the only power that can heal the fatally sick world. It is our calling to hold fast what we have in Christ in our own time. Not in theirs, because he's talking about what was in the past. And so it is from our own time that we must take the material with which to prepare that form today. That labor is enormous. These words of Kuyper were for his congregation in Utrecht, but the sentiment conveyed is central to Kuyper's strategy for theology and practice for his time. Our task today is the same. And it includes a faith that requires us not merely to ask how we cultivate a tradition for our time, but also how this becomes a perpetual practice that strives to present and practice the faith in a manner for our time, really a manner around our time and in different places. In a manner where we aspire to be agents who keep applying updated theological and ethical sealant to the cracks in the tradition. In a way, we give attention to the broken pieces and broken places, as well as casting new versions for the tradition from the original Kuyperian mold. We look back and attend to the tradition passed to us, and we also look forward and stoke our creativity as we, to use Kuyper's words above, look for the emergence of new blossoms. So what could this be like? So this is part of the Neo-Kuyperian opportunity. Then I'll wrap it and we'll have some time for questions. Number one, I've already talked a little bit about this, but enthusiasm and humility. As I said, God's given gifts to us all, and some of us may even be geniuses like Kuyper. It's possible. Our enthusiasm and joy in using our abilities is warranted, but our recognition of Kuyper's cracks can prompt us to discern our own cracks. In other words, look at yourself. In other words, look at Kuyper's cracks, then look in the mirror. And then, as we're doing that, while we're doing that, we have our confidence clothed with humility, because we know that we surely have our own blind spots. And this is why I'm saying we need each other's help to make sure we avoid the intoxication of our abilities and to be reminded of our constant need for the growth in our character. So I think that is a really important part of what we need to do. Second, There's certainly the opportunity to be part of pursuing better approaches to race and justice. It's interesting that if you look in Kuyper, at certain points, he sounds like the person that's going to be on the way to providing this revolution. I mean, he says that, Calvinism, is against all forms of caste and slavery. He seemed to be, and I think he meant it. But it's as if his theological claims could not overcome the gravitational pull of his cultural beliefs. And so even within Kuyper, there are some things that help us to pursue a better approach to race and to justice. And please understand, in these times in which we're living, there is such a tremendous opportunity for those who name the name of Christ to be those who are providing a way of talking truthfully about the horrors of race in the past and considering constructive ways, socially and politically, economically, et cetera, to address that. I wish I could say that we're overrun with Christians who are doing this, but we're still waiting. There are people who are doing it, more people that were doing it 20, 30 years ago, but more means nothing like anything like a mob of people doing this. So there is that opportunity. It remains. And also it remains as part really of an experimental enterprise. And what I mean by that is, whatever we are proposing for making society better around the issues of race and justice, it really is experimental, because none of us sees clearly enough. None of us have a realized eschatological vision. So whatever we propose is a proposal. And whatever we put into place is going to be maybe pretty good, but it's not going to be the end of the story. So it's always going to be subject to revision. In terms of cultural engagement itself, there are lots of ways to talk about that. There was very interesting conversations about that at this conference. It's important for us to participate in this challenge of engagement and to embrace it while having a strong allergy toward triumphalism. In the last session, one of the things that Gray said was part of the problem with certain receptions of Kuyper is that people read certain quotes and then they think that those quotes mean that basically, oh, God is sovereign. And so what does that mean? That means God's sovereign, it all belongs to him. So what does that mean? Bacote translation. I get to take over the cosmos is what it means, which is not what he was talking about, of course. We need to be wary of the specter of triumphalism because, again, no matter what we propose in terms of engagement in society, we just don't have that clear of a vision. And even all of us together at our best is still not going to be a realized eschatological vision. So we have to always be aware of that and be aware of that triumphalistic temptation while still seeking transformation. Here's another way to think about this in terms of the ongoing task itself, big picture. It's really like practicing what's in Philippians 2:12-13, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. In other words, it is a big task. As Kuyper said, this work is tremendous. The infinite God has given us finite people this incredible faith that is not supposed to just only look a certain way in the Netherlands, only look a certain way in the United States, only look a certain way in Brazil, and on it goes. There's all this work of all kinds of things. Whether you're a dogmatics person, whether you're a historian, whether you're an economist, whether you're a psychologist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's all manner of work here for us to work out with fear and trembling, but with the encouragement of 1 Corinthians 15:56, where we know our labor is not in vain. And it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be not in vain. God can handle the work that we produce as imperfect people. We don't need to put messianic weight on our experimental enterprise. We can just continue to keep at it. This is an opportunity to participate and protect, perpetually gazing upon the cracks, sealing them again and again in our collective efforts to understand what God has revealed and to put it into practice within ourselves and out among God's world. As also was mentioned in the session about the Neo-Calvinism introduction. Neo-Calvinism is not just about the horizontal. It's also about the vertical. I mean, people read Kuyper and they get excited about engaging the world. It's like, hey, remember, whatever you think about him and about his church attendance, he wrote a lot of devotionals, right? And whatever you might think about his character problems, he had some kind of piety. It was an imperfect one, but he had it. And so he cared about what's on the inside as much as he cared about what was going on out there. And so it is a holistic faith, a holistic enterprise that we're talking about. So that's why it's within ourselves and out among God. Kuyper made his effort. And now we have the task in our times and places. And then we will hand down our revised and refined versions of the tradition, reflecting on both the challenges as well as our favorite parts of the tradition. With awareness of our own frailty, but also with confidence that God can make much of our efforts. In the end, our goal is not to put our theological Humpty Dumptys back together, but to join the work with other broken and frail fellow travelers, visiting the cracks in Kuyper and others again and again, applying the sealant of our efforts as we all move toward the final healing that awaits us in God's consummated kingdom. Thanks.
Questions?
Thank you very much. Standard reform thinking says that I am wholly sinful through and through. There's not that good part. Langdon Gilkey wrote this book called Shangon Compound, where he's this great young guy, very optimistic, very liberal in his Christianity, goes to the compound, sees these great missionaries who've given their lives to reach out to Chinese people and evangelize them. And now they're in this compound and they turn out to be peevish and unforgiving of each other and constantly, me.
Yeah.
So he learns the true Reformed doctrine. Okay, now I look at myself. I look at myself for a second, and I think in terms of three different things: personal, ethnic, and cultural racism.
Yeah.
I grew up in Oakland. I grew up in a mostly black high school, et cetera, et cetera. My daughters say that I'm a racist. They're 22 and 24. They're very thoughtful. They're both well educated. They say I'm a racist.
Sure.
You mentioned that about Kuyper.
Mhm.
And I still wonder, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I really did grow up with, not most white kids. But then I sort of think to myself, am I a racist? And last few years, I thought about that again and again. In a way, I've been thinking about it ever since I graduated from high school in 1968.
Yeah.
But I think then of the Reformed doctrine, I think, well, of course, when somebody says, well, we're all racist, so I think, no, come on, we're not. But in a sense, the Reformed doctrine would say, well, of course we are, because we're going to hate anybody who doesn't look like me when we get pushed, right? That's Langdon Gilkey's thing. Once you push these people, take away their food, take away their comforts, boy, they're mean, they're awful, they're hateful. And anybody who doesn't look like me, it's even worse. So I've often tried to think of myself, can I catch myself in really being a racist? I don't like those black kids. I don't like those black people. I don't like downtown Oakland when they're doing this and this and this. And since you talked about Kuyper in this context, I'm still trying to figure that out. I realize it's just too big a question, et cetera, but if you could help us in that, I think it's really important. And, because we think we'd like to repent. I would like to, but it's really hard to repent when you keep thinking, but I'm not really sure in what way am I racist, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the first thing I would say is we have to decouple the question from any kind of culture wars type of thing that's going on, right? Because with all the ideology right now, that makes it hard, I think, for some people to have the proper self-reflection, but also to deal with the complexity of it, because everybody's life experience isn't the same. Everybody isn't going to, however they think about racism or how they learn to think about it, they're not going to conceive of it the same way. So even if someone says, hey, did you know that you're a racist, or you can't help being a racist because you're white? The problem is that most people to whom you say that have no idea what you're talking about. Because when people are saying that, they don't mean, hey, don't you know that you have a certain kind of very aware to yourself personal prejudice toward other people, and that you also have, to the extent that you're capable of it, you put into practice things that disadvantage people that are not like you, right? Most people are not thinking that, right? They're thinking about, they're not thinking that about this way of talking about race and the modern world, and if you're of European descent, then you can't help it. Because that's not still what most people are thinking about. So part of the problem is a discourse problem, right? So to which I would say, here's the big thing people need to think about, whether the term is racism or not. Okay, just admit what you think about other people, what you think about the rest of this world, how you come to understand the world, how you come to understand what makes things maybe easier or harder for you in the world. And also think about the extent to which you're willing or unwilling to trust people if they tell you that they've experienced things related to race. Because a lot of times the problem is people are very good at telling other people about what their experience is. Right, say, I'll let you know when you experience racism. Right, I always think, try that in a marriage with your spouse. I'll let you know you're having a bad day and see how that works out for you, right? Because it's the same kind of thing, except you're saying it to other people. I'll tell you what your experience is. And a lot of times that's the dynamic that's going on. People are so interested about interpreting what other people's dynamics are, rather than saying, okay, what are they saying? What happened? What's going on? How do I understand what they're describing to me? Because a person might say, I think that you did something to me because you're a racist, they say. All right. You might think, I have no idea what you're talking about. Hopefully you can have a kind of relationship with them where you can ask, hey, can you help me to understand what you're seeing, perceiving, what you felt, and how is that connected to what you're understanding racism to be? I think that's more of the kind of thing that I think we need to have happen. So we have to be willing to listen. We have to be willing to be honest about ourselves. And big picture, we need to be willing to just recognize, I mean, at least reform people, I think, would do this. If you're thinking about what people have done in building societies in the world, do you really expect anybody to build a society that was built for everybody? For the equality of everyone, and not for the advantage of certain people? I mean, please somebody let me know when you find that society. Right, so it shouldn't surprise us. Why? Because this is what people do after Genesis 3. And what people want to call it, certain versions of a racist society, is just one dimension of how some people have built the modern world. They built the world for themselves. Why? In fact, when I want my students to understand what white supremacy is, I'll say, who built the modern world? Europeans. You think they built it for everybody? They didn't. Right? They built it for themselves. Right? Just like if you go anywhere else. If you go anywhere else, I mean, you know, so I think we have to think about it with more complexity in that way. And what I would say is, in terms of, you know, if owning whether being a racist or not, to me, the bigger thing is, am I just willing to be honest about where I'm at? And to be okay with the fact that if I believe all the stuff about God being merciful and God being transformative, then why am I surprised if God shows me, hey, did you know that there's this thing still going on with you? Or that there's this thing that you never thought about? If we're willing to let that be really our disposition, then it's easier for us to think about, okay, well, maybe I didn't think about it that way, but I can see how somebody might put that under the category of racist, right? As opposed to thinking about that racist is some value judgment where you get eternal condemnation. Right? So I think that's some thoughts about how to address that.
Yeah, Peter Sherman, adjunct here at Redeemer. You have this phrase, acknowledge the liabilities without dismissing the person.
Yes.
So I did my PhD on charismatic leadership and took a case study of a guy named Bruxy Cavey, who's in this area of the
Okay.
planet. And wrote a book on it. And 2 years later, he was charged with sexual assault and 3 other counts of sexual misconduct, also called clergy sexual abuse. Now, as a scholar of this case study for me, he had a online sermon search engine of 20 years of his sermon material. I could go there and plug in a text, a word, whatever, and I'd get the sermons where he had talked about those things.
Mhm.
And within a couple of weeks, they wiped the whole thing out. And it's gone.
Mhm.
It doesn't exist
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
So my question is, do you draw a line somewhere?
Yes.
You said 99% versus 1.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, it's a great question. The point is not that there are no situations where you might say, okay, it's probably too difficult to engage X, right? So John Howard Yoder. Okay, I mean, you're not gonna get Hauerwas without getting Yoder. So should you still teach John Howard Yoder? I mean, numerous unwanted sexual advances by a person, of course, who's known for talking about nonviolence, right? So do you still teach Yoder? I teach him because of his importance. I think if you teach a person, you have to teach the person, whether it's disclaimers or whatever, you're helping people to understand, you know what? Okay, this is a controversial person. And this is a person who, in this case, said these things, but for whatever reason did these things. And you need to be able to tell the truth about both. And to also, honestly, to in some ways say, yes, I'm telling you about this person because it's not just about those things. There might have been other important contributions this person made to society, let's say, right? Then I think what you want to do is to say, so how do we deal with this? But then I think it's important in the Christian context to ask people, and how are you dealing with yourself? Because there are no fully sanctified persons. Right? I mean, how many people want to say, in our confessional society, I today will unveil for you, right, every dysfunction about my person. Now, please do not. Right, and by no thought balloons, I have no idea what's going on in your life. But the point is I think we need to have people thinking about really using these things as opportunities for reflection about themselves, and also about how we navigate the lives of people in leadership. And if you're going to be that kind of person, are there people in your life? Are there ways that people, because you said charismatic leadership, what happens a lot of times, the further a person goes up, the further they get away from people who can ever say, hey, do you realize that while your gifts are taking you somewhere, your character is not going there with you? And we can see that your character is not going there with you. And so it's only going to be a matter of time. It may be after you die or whatever, but somebody's going to find out that your gifts were amazing, but your character was dissonant with what you were doing with your gifts. So I think that kind of thing is part of what we need to do, especially in this context of simple cancellation, et cetera, because I just wonder how many people that want someone canceled want themselves to be canceled because of their own problems. And my point is not simple moral equivalence, because there are certain moral offenses that have greater impact and we can say are worse than others in certain ways. But I think often there is a crisis of discernment or a lack of discernment about how to deal with human beings as complex persons. And so I think we need to do that. So you know, should that, all those sermons be up there? Well, it depends on the denomination, first of all, right? But I think, maybe at some point, but it needs to probably be up there with people also knowing, okay, you know, we were so glad that this happened. We lament that this is also what happened. We have to be able to kind of hold both. Because here's the truth. There are a lot of people who've done a lot of great and helpful things, and who are also probably not really very good people in terms of their character. They might be moral disasters, but they do these things that have some kind of public benefit. I mean, that is part of the conundrum. That's part of the conundrum.
Join me in thanking Vince. That concludes our final plenary session. We have a lunch break now. Lunch is right through those doors. We will reconvene at 1 p.m. for the final paper sessions in the Cars building. Thank you.